So to see an African government, regardless of whether there's a neo-colonial influence or whatever, acting out the script of some guy in Europe to the extent of dropping bombs on not just another African country, but on its next door neighbor that it shares its most economically important border with. It's just absolutely unconscionable. And it's clear that the coup itself, if it was a coup that was like a Guinea-Bissau or Gabon style coup, whose role was to like entrench the status quo, the reaction would have been very different. It would have been clear. It's obvious that this was an anti-imperial coup. The reaction makes that very obvious. The fact that not only did all these so-called international institutions like ECOWAS and the AU get involved, which they wouldn't have done if it was the other kind of coup, but just the ferocity of the response to the extent where the Nigerian president actually broke Nigerian law. He actually went against the constitution, because under Nigerian law, before the Nigerian military can be deployed outside of Nigeria's borders, permission must be taken from the Senate. This is stated very clearly in the constitution. You are not permitted to deploy the Nigerian military outside of Nigeria's borders except with express permission from the Senate. The Senate has to vote on it. And here you have a situation where a coup starts happening early Saturday morning, and by Saturday afternoon, there's Nigerian Air Force jets in the sky over Cotonou. So clearly there was no hint of any sort of parliamentary permission or any sort of constitutional process. It was clear that there was an instruction from Emmanuel Macron. He actually posted about it, so this isn't speculation. He actually said, essentially, I called up my houseboy and I gave him these instructions. And these instructions were carried out very efficiently, very quickly, and very brutally against an African neighbor in a way that is just unprecedented. So there's two things about Benin. First of all, it's a coastal West African state which shares borders with two of the three AES countries. So it has borders with Burkina Faso and with Niger. Now, if you've been following the news for the longest time, for well over a year, or even 2 years now, there's been a diplomatic dispute, which I think recently got resolved between Niger and Benin, where Niger accused Benin of basically harboring terrorists who were carrying out attacks on AES territory and then retreating into Benin. And as I recall, the Nigerian president, Abdurrahman Chiani, actually came out and made a declaration that there's a secret French military base close to the Beninese border with Burkina Faso. And the Beninese authorities initially denied this, but the story eventually came out that there is in fact a border about a French military base about 50 kilometers from the Burkinabe border. And it's very interesting that a lot of these terror attacks targeting both Niger and Burkina Faso the attackers seem to emanate from that geographical area, and they always seem to retreat back to that area where the AES forces cannot follow. But some would say that's conjecture, but what you can verify is that French military presence in Benin, the French consider Benin to be a strategic military staging point for them, because Benin is used for spying flights, basically. Overflying Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The French themselves have admitted this. You can go to Flight Radar and confirm this for yourself. Almost on a daily basis, the French military flights taking off from Cotonou Kajehoun Airport, overflying the AES, and these are basically spying flights. So losing Benin would essentially have lost France a valuable part of its military infrastructure in that region, similar to how losing Niger cost the US its drone base in Agadez. So that's the one thing. The second thing, which is probably even more important, is that if Benin were to have an anti-imperialist government come into power, which would develop close economic and diplomatic ties with the AES, possibly even join the AES, what that would mean is that the AES would finally have a port. Because the one strategic weakness of the AES, which has still not been fixed, is the fact that it's entirely landlocked. So for its international trade, it depends on bilateral relationships with countries like Togo and Ghana, which are decent for the time being, but are subject to change. right? Having having Benin join the fold would make it such that AES would no longer have that strategic weakness. It would have its own direct access to the sea, and that would change the economic and political dynamic of French West Africa forever. So I think, first of all, from a Nigerian point of view, this has been a strategic own goal, because when President Trump made those threats of coming in guns a-blazing, the argument that was employed by the Nigerian government was that regardless of what may or may not be happening in Nigeria to whatever group of people, it's an internal Nigerian issue in a sovereign country. So what happens in a sovereign country is the business of that sovereign country, and no external entity has the right to deploy a military to intervene. Now, Nigeria has done exactly that, right? Because Benin is a sovereign country. A sovereign event, which is a military coup, took place in Benin. It is the Beninese state's prerogative and the Beninese people's prerogative to deal with that issue. Nigeria itself is a country which has had nothing fewer than 6 different military coups in its own history. Certainly nobody ever invaded Nigeria because it had a coup, right? So, but by doing this, that has essentially given Mr. Trump a sort of narrative justification that if you can take this action in a presumably sovereign country because it did something that you didn't approve of, then if we say that you have done something we don't approve of, we can do the exact same thing to you. So I think that has been a huge own goal from Nigeria. But from a US perspective, yes, I would say there clearly has been, I wouldn't call it a tussle, more of horse trading going on between the US and France. There is some reordering going on in the world right now. We're obviously entering a more multipolar era, and as part of that era, and this has happened in Africa before, by the way, when there's power shifts happening, and then these European, or in this case American powers, then begin sort of divvying up African territories freshly, which is how come you have countries like Togo, which were once German colonies, later on became French colonies. So something similar, albeit a lot less obvious, may be what we're witnessing, not just in Nigeria, but across the region, where there's this unspoken sort of attrition going on between the US and France, where the US believes that in pursuit of its own sovereign interests, which basically boil down to access to critical minerals, as it describes it, there are certain parts of Africa that it wishes to dominate. Some of those parts of Africa are currently dominated by France, and the US believes, well, maybe if these places do not have such French involvement any longer, maybe that presents an opportunity for US involvement.